I knew I was in trouble not when we first kissed, and certainly not during the grand, performative gestures people usually mistake for love. No, I realized I was lost the moment I began to memorize the way he didn't speak. Most people are terrified of silence. They feel the need to coat the world in a layer of meaningless chatter, just to keep the darkness at bay. But Elias lived in the gaps. He inhabited the stillness like it was his natural element. We were perched on the rusted, salt-eaten fire escape of his third-floor walk-up in a corner of the city that felt forgotten by time. The air that evening was a heavy, damp wool blanket, smelling of looming summer storms and that specific pungent tang of rain hitting sun-baked asphalt. He wasn't even looking at me. He was just peeling an orange. That was it. Just an orange. But as I watched him, I felt a physical shift in my chest. A heavy bone-deep realization that my center of gravity had moved. He dug his thumb into the pith with a methodical, quiet grace, his scarred knuckles moving with a precision that made the simple act feel like a ritual. He peeled it in one single perfect spiral, the citrus skin falling to the metal grating like a discarded thought. I found myself mapping him, the way the flickering orange streetlight caught the faint indentation on his temple, the rhythmic, steady pulse in the hollow of his throat, the way his shoulders stayed squared even when he was relaxed. It wasn't a butterfly feeling. It was the terrifying visceral pull of a planet being drawn into the orbit of a sun. I knew then that if he moved I would tip. If he disappeared, I would cease to have a direction to fall in. He felt like home, but not the safe kind with a white picket fence and a locked door. He felt like the home you cling to during a Category 5 hurricane, where the walls are groaning and the windows are rattling, but you stay because you know the sky would crush you the second you stepped outside. We spent those early months in a golden syrupy haze that felt insulated from the rest of the world. Our dates weren't the stuff of romantic comedies. There were no candlelit dinners or walks on the beach. Instead, there were hours spent on the hardwood floor of my apartment, the only sound being the rhythmic click-hiss of the old radiator and the distant siren of an ambulance 3 streets over. We shared silences that were more intimate than any sexual encounter, more revealing than any late-night confession. I'd watch him fix things, a leaky faucet, a crooked picture frame, the loose hinge on my front door, and I'd feel this ache of gratitude so sharp it felt like a serrated edge. I believed, with the naive arrogance of the newly loved, that we were building a sanctuary. I didn't know then that a sanctuary is often just a beautiful word for a place where you wait for the world to find you. I was so consumed by the electricity of him, by the way his presence seemed to ground my chaotic thoughts, that I ignored the first short circuits in my own body. I was a ticking clock and he was the man who thought he had all the time in the world. I would lie awake next to him, listening to his steady breathing, and try to imagine a version of the future where this didn't end in wreckage. I couldn't. Even then, in the peak of our warm gold phase, I could feel the coldness of the wedding ring I hadn't yet received, not as a promise but as a weight. I loved him with a desperation that should have been a warning sign. Every touch was an anchor, every look a promise I knew I might not be able to keep. I was drowning in the sheer beautiful weight of him, and the most terrifying part was that I didn't want to be saved. I just wanted the water to stay this warm for as long as the universe would allow. I was mapping a coastline I knew was destined to erode, falling for a man who fixed things, while knowing I was the one thing he would never be able to mend. The fog didn't roll in with the dramatic flare of a cinematic storm. It leaked into our lives like a slow poison, silent and persistent. It started with the small things, the kind of glitches you dismiss because you're too busy being happy. A tremor in my left hand that I hid by tucking it under the dinner table, or the way I suddenly found myself winded after climbing the 2 flights of stairs to our sanctuary. But eventually, the glitches became the reality. My world, once defined by the sharp, vibrant edges of Elias's presence, began to blur. I felt a heavy, suffocating thickness in my thoughts, as if my consciousness was being submerged in cold, wet silk. The spark, that vital electric hum of my own identity, was short-circuiting, and there was nothing I could do to steady the current. The definitive turning point, the moment the warm gold of our life officially turned into a clinical bruising blue, happened on a Tuesday that felt like any other. I was in the kitchen trying to perform the simple human task of pouring a glass of water. The yellow light overhead was flickering with a dying rhythmic hum that set my nerves on edge. I reached for the glass, but my fingers simply forgot their purpose. They didn't grip. They didn't even feel the cold surface of the tumbler. The glass didn't just fall. It seemed to vanish from my reality before shattering against the linoleum tiles with a sound like a gunshot. I stood there, paralyzed, staring at the crystalline shards scattered around my bare feet. My brain was screaming at me to move, to step away from the danger, but my legs were disconnected, heavy as lead. I watched a thin red line of blood bloom across my toe where a sliver had grazed me, but I felt nothing. No pain. Just a hollow, terrifying distance. Elias walked into the room then. He didn't rush to me with the frantic, messy concern of a lover who still believes things can be fixed. He stopped dead in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the harsh shadows of the hallway. And in that silence I saw the shift. For the first time since we met, he didn't look at me with hunger or tenderness, or that quiet, steady devotion that made me feel invincible. He looked at me with pity. It was a jagged, visceral look, the way a person looks at a terminal engine that has finally seized or a bird with a snapped wing. In his eyes, I was no longer the woman who mapped his coastline. I was a problem to be managed. The electric chemistry that had been our oxygen was replaced by a sterile, suffocating tension. He moved toward me eventually, but his steps were stiff and cautious, as if I were made of the very glass he was now stooping to sweep up. He didn't meet my eyes. He focused on the shards, his movements mechanical. In that moment I realized the gravity had reversed. I wasn't his partner anymore, I was his burden. I was the shadow in the room. A ghost inhabiting a body that was slowly turning into a cage of bone and failing nerves. The smell of the room changed. The scent of his sandalwood and our shared dinners was replaced by the metallic, sharp smell of blood and the ozone of a dying light bulb. I wanted to scream, to tell him to look at me, to find me beneath the glitch, but my voice felt like it was buried under layers of sand. He was already mourning the woman I used to be. Even as I stood right in front of him, bleeding on the kitchen floor. The silence between us, once a sanctuary, had become a wall. He was sweeping up the pieces of our life, and I was just another fragment of the mess. The coldness of the wedding ring I never got felt like a shackle now. A reminder that I had brought him into a house that was already on fire. Elias became a ghost who refused to leave the haunting. He didn't quit. He was far too noble for a clean exit, but he vanished into the hollow spaces of his own skin. From my vantage point on the sofa, where the world had narrowed down to the texture of a wool blanket and the specific patterns of shadows on the ceiling, I watched his quiet screams. He thought I couldn't see them. He thought that because my body was failing, my perception had dimmed, but the illness had actually sharpened my eyes to the nuances of his agony. I became a scholar of his grief. I watched him through the window when he came home from work. He would sit in his truck for 20-30 minutes, his hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, staring at the garage door as if it were a firing squad. He was psyching himself up just to walk through the door and face the sight of me. Inside the house, he was a man made of brittle glass. He fought a war against my biology every single day, and every day he lost a little more of himself. The man who used to peel oranges with such effortless grace now fumbled with pill bottles, his fingers trembling with a frantic, suppressed energy. He spent his nights hunched over a laptop in the kitchen, the harsh blue light etching deep, skeletal lines into his face as he searched for miracles in the dark, expensive corners of medical journals. He grew thin, his clothes hanging off a frame that used to feel like a fortress I could hide within. The hum in his voice, that low vibration that used to settle my soul, was gone. It was replaced by a forced, terrifyingly polite cheerfulness. A customer service version of love that hurt worse than if he had simply screamed at me to go away. The breaking point didn't come with a fight. It came with a mirror. One evening I dragged myself toward the bathroom, my movements slow and agonizing. The door was cracked open. Elias was standing in front of the vanity, the motion sensor light having timed out, leaving him in near total darkness. He didn't know I was there. He was pressing his forehead against the glass of the mirror, his shoulders shaking with a sob that never made a sound. It wasn't a cry for help. It was the sound of a structural collapse. He was breaking in slow motion, a man whose honor had become a cage he was too proud to break out of. He stayed because he felt he had to, but every time his eyes met mine, I saw him searching for an exit that didn't involve a casket. His silence was no longer an ocean we could swim in together. It was a frozen wasteland, and I was on the side that was freezing to death. He was becoming a martyr, and I was becoming his cross. I wanted to reach out, to touch the back of his neck and tell him it was okay to leave, that I didn't want to be the reason his spark died too. But the fog in my throat was a physical barrier. We were two people trapped in a sinking ship, both of us pretending the water wasn't already at our chins. I watched him stare into that dark mirror, and I realized that the man I loved was already gone, replaced by a hollowed-out version of himself who was simply waiting for the end. He was a fixer who had finally encountered something that wouldn't stay fixed, and the realization was eroding him from the inside out. We were dying together, just in different ways. Every tragedy has a basement, a cold, forgotten space where the secrets are kept until the floorboards rot through and the truth finally spills out. Elias found mine on a rainy Thursday while I was drifting in a medicated haze, my mind floating somewhere between the ceiling and the gray sky outside. It wasn't a hidden medical file or a doctor's letter that betrayed me. It was my old journal bound in scuffed, salt-stained leather and buried in the back of a linen closet I thought he'd never have a reason to touch. I had hidden it behind the spare blankets we never used, beneath the weight of a life I was pretending was new. He found the truth I had intentionally, surgically omitted from our narrative. I knew. I had known since I was 19 years old that this glitch was written into my DNA. A jagged inheritance from a mother I barely remembered. I had walked into our fire escape romance with my eyes wide open, knowing I was a ticking clock. I had let him build a life, a business, and a heart on a foundation I knew was actively rotting from the inside out. I had traded his future for a few years of feeling normal, in his arms, selfishly consuming his vitality to fuel my own fading spark. I had watched him fall in love with a woman I knew was a temporary tenant in her own body. I woke up to find him sitting at the foot of the bed. The room was dark, save for the rhythmic, violent drumming of rain against the windowpane that sounded like 1,000 tiny hammers trying to break through the glass. The journal was open in his lap, the pages white and accusing in the dim light. He didn't look up when I stirred. "You knew," he whispered. The words weren't a question, they were a sentence. His voice lacked the pity that had defined the last few months. It was replaced by a devastating, quiet fury. A cold, crystalline anger that made the air in the room feel thin and impossible to breathe. "I would have stayed anyway," he said, his voice finally cracking like a dry branch under the weight of a heavy snow. "That's the part you didn't trust. You thought you had to trick me into being your martyr. You didn't love me enough to let me choose this life, Sarah. You stole my choice." He stood up, and for a terrifying moment, I thought he would finally walk out, that the betrayal of his trust would be the one thing his fixer's heart couldn't mend. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and the metallic tang of my own fear. But Elias was a man of action, even when the action was born of a desperate, broken pact with the future. He didn't head for the door. He went to the desk, picked up the phone, and made a call I had strictly forbidden him to make, to a specialist in a city 3 states away who performed a radical, experimental procedure that insurance wouldn't touch. To fund it, I realized later, he had already signed the papers to sell his father's workshop, the only thing he truly owned, the place where the smell of sawdust and oil made him feel like a king. He made a choice in that dark room, a high-stakes gamble to save a woman who had lied to him. He saved my life that night, but in doing so, he committed a kind of spiritual suicide. He murdered the man from the fire escape, the one who peeled oranges and lived in the silence, and replaced him with a man who had simply decided to survive me, no matter the cost to his soul. The confrontation wasn't loud. It was the sound of a heart turning to stone. The surgery worked. The glitch that had been written into my DNA, the silent predator that had been stalking me since my 19th year, was surgically excised by the hands of a man we couldn't afford. The fog lifted almost instantly, leaving behind a world that was sharp, clear, and terrifyingly cold. My hands stopped their rhythmic trembling. My lungs finally expanded to their full capacity without the sensation of breathing through wet silk. I was cured. I was whole. I was a medical miracle documented in a leather-bound file. But as the physical weight of the illness evaporated, it was replaced by a psychic gravity that was far more difficult to carry. I woke up to a reality where the woman had been saved, but the man I loved was gone. Elias was still there, physically. He sat in the plastic chair by my hospital bed, and later, He sat across from me at the small wooden table in our kitchen. But the man from the fire escape, the one who lived in the shared silences and found poetry in the peeling of an orange, had been replaced by a stranger made of flint and iron. The survivor's guilt was no longer just a concept. It was a third person living in our house, a cold, unmoving presence that sat between us at every meal. Every time I took a deep, effortless breath, I was acutely aware of the oxygen he was no longer getting. Every time I walked across the room with steady, confident feet, I saw the ghost of the father's workshop he had sold to pay for my balance. He had liquidated his history, his pride, and his sense of self to buy me a future I had originally lied to him about. The transformation in him was skeletal. He had grown harder, his gaze perpetually fixed on some distant horizon I could no longer see. The warmth that used to radiate from him had been replaced by a brittle, polished professionalism. He took care of me with the mechanical efficiency of a clockmaker. He changed my dressings, timed my follow-up medications, and stocked the fridge with precision, but he did it all without the hum. That low vibration in his voice that used to settle my soul had flatlined into a monotone. I would try to reach out, to touch the back of his hand or the curve of his jaw, and I would feel him flinch, just a fraction of a millimeter, before he would force himself to stay still. It wasn't a flinch of disgust. It was the flinch of a man who had been burned so badly, he no longer trusted the heat, even when it came from the woman he had sacrificed everything to save. I realized then that there is a specific kind of trauma in being rescued. I was saved, but the cost of my life was the murder of his spirit. He had protected me, he had kept his promise to stay, but he had lost his softness in the process. He looked at me not with the hunger of a lover, but with the weary eyes of a creditor who had settled a debt he never wanted to take on. We were living in the ruins of the man who had mended me. I would watch him stand in the kitchen, staring at the empty space where his tools used to be, and I would feel a shame so profound it made my newly steady hands shake again. I had my life back, but I was a stranger in it. I was a survivor, yes, but I was also the architect of the tragedy that had hollowed out the best man I ever knew. He had pulled me from the fire, but he had stayed in the flames long enough to forget how to breathe anything but smoke. We were fine, the doctor said. We were lucky, our friends whispered. But as I watched him navigate our home with the stiff, careful movements of a soldier in a minefield, I knew the truth. I was whole, he was broken, and the love that had once been our sanctuary was now just the museum where we kept the pieces of who we used to be. We are sitting on that same rusted fire escape now, perched above the city that has continued to move on without us. It has been a full year since the surgery, and the air tonight doesn't hold the heavy, humid promise of a summer rain. It smells of winter, sharp, clean and unforgiving. We are not the people we were when we first mapped each other's coastlines in the golden haze of our youth. We have entered the era of the happily ever changed. There is no going back to the fire escape romance of part 1, and we have finally stopped the exhausting, heartbreaking work of trying to find the path that leads there. We have accepted that some maps are burned so that new territories can be discovered. I have a physical scar on my chest, a thin silver-white line that marks the place where the world went in to fix me. It is a permanent signature of my survival. But the real scars, the ones that carry the true weight of our story, are the ones I cannot see. The ones etched into the way Elias moves through the world. They are in the way his shoulders no longer drop when he enters a room, the way he no longer whistles when he works with his hands, and the way he looks at an orange and simply leaves it on the counter unpeeled. We have learned to live in the beauty of the scar. It is a different kind of love now, one that is stripped of its ornaments and its easy laughter. It is a conscious, heavy choice made every single morning when we wake up and see the wreckage of our past reflected in each other's eyes. It is the kind of love that exists after the sanctuary has burned to the ground, and you've decided to build a life out of the charred timber, because you have nowhere else to go and no one else you'd rather be homeless with. I used to believe, with the frantic idealism of the unhurt, that love was a fusion, two people becoming one perfect, seamless, and whole entity. I was wrong. I see now that love is actually a slow, mutual breaking. It is the terrifying willingness to let your edges be worn down by another person's needs, to let your shape be altered and your identity eroded, until you don't recognize yourself in the mirror anymore. All so you can fit into the jagged, irregular gaps the other person left behind in their wake. I look at Elias and I don't see a hero, and I certainly don't see a martyr. I see a man who saw the ugliest, most selfish truth I had to offer, the lie I told to keep him, and decided that the lie was worth saving anyway. He didn't stay because he was a saint. He stayed because he was already part of the debris. We don't talk about the journal anymore. We don't talk about the sold workshop or the months of blue light silence that nearly swallowed us whole. We talk about the mundane details of a shared existence. The grocery list, the leaking roof, the way the light hits the brickwork of the building across the street during the golden hour. We stay because the breaking is finally done, and there is a strange, quiet, and profound peace in being shattered together. The stakes are no longer about life or death. They are about the endurance of the spirit. Love isn't about staying whole. It's about who is willing to break with you and, more importantly, who is willing to stay for the long, quiet cleanup afterward. We are the architects of a ruined cathedral, still kneeling at the altar because the light still hits it just right. I survived the fall, but he's the one who forgot how to fly.
Subscribe, like, and tell people about this love.